Warning, this video is HDR and you're going to see videos that are HDR. So if you are via mobile, use the YouTube app and tweak the HDR on advanced settings. If you are from desktop, be sure to use an HDR display. Thanks and have a nice watching. HDR, which stands for High Dynamic Range, is a technique used in photography and videography to capture and display a wider range of brightness and color than traditional methods, such the SDR, Standard Dynamic Range. The main difference between HDR and SDR stands in the range of details, colors, and brightness that can be displayed in both the brightest and darkest area of the image. An HDR image can capture a greater range of brightness level than an HDR image, which means that it can display more details in the shadow and highlights of an image. It's good to think and remember the early days of HDR photography, when people used to unrealistic push data of the file just because they could. But let's start from the basics. What makes the real differences between HDR and SDR? Here are the four main ones: brightness, contrast, color, and details. Starting from brightness, HDR images can display much brighter highlights and darker shadows than SDR images. This means that HDR images have more detail in both brightest and darkest areas of the image. The number of nits and values required for base HDR deliveries can vary depending on the specific HDR standards being used. Let's say the HDR10, which is the most common HDR standard, the minimum peak brightness required is 1000 nits. This means that the display must be capable of reaching a brightness level of at least 1000 nits in order to fully display the HDR content. And this thing evolved even more if we talk about specific standards such as Dolby Vision, Netflix, Prime Video, etc. If you want to go in details about all this and everything we will be talking about in this video, please check the link below and follow the blog article in shop.plasma.film. Second point is the contrast. HDR images have much higher contrast than SDR images, with more distinct differences between the brightest and darkest areas of the image. This makes the image look more vibrant and realistic, and also the contrast is a crucial aspect of HDR imaging, as it enables the display of finer details and subtle gradation of brightness. The contrast value specification in HDR can vary depending on the specific delivery standard being used. Again, for HDR standards as the HDR10, we have a minimum contrast ratio of 10,000 to 1. That means that the brightest part of the image must be at least 10,000 times brighter than the darkest part of the image. Then we got the point 3 about color and color spaces. Color spaces are another important aspect of HDR imaging, as it defines the range of colors that can be displayed in the image. The base for the HDR is Rec 2020. It covers more of the visible spectrum than Rec 709 and supports a wider range of color luminance and saturation. However, not all displays are capable of fully reproducing the Rec 2020 color space, and some HDR content may be delivered in other color spaces such as DCI P3, which is commonly used in cinema. Number 4 stands for details. One of the key benefits of HDR is the ability to display more detail in both the brightest and darkest part of the image. This is achieved through the use of wider dynamic range, which allows for finer gradation of brightness and contrast. As said, in SDR content, the maximum brightness level is often limited around 1000 nits, while in HDR we go often to 1000 nits as a minimum peak. This higher brightness level allows for a more natural immersive viewing experience, with greater depth and details in highlights and shadows. In addition to increased brightness, HDR content also typically use higher bit depth than SDR content. While SDR content is often encoded with 8 bits per color channel, HDR content is typically encoded with 10 bits and more for channel, allowing for a greater range of possibility, colors, and shades. And that said, another challenge of the HDR content delivery stands in the dynamic metadata. Dynamic metadata allow the content to be optimized on a scene-by-scene basis for specific capabilities of the display device. This can help to ensure that the content is displayed as intended, with the maximum detail and nuance available on each individual display. Color spaces, area level, and nits are all important factors in HDR. But now, as you were guessing, comes my personal experience with HDR. So let me tell you this, I'm not working on a daily basis on HDR. I normally use an ISO that is not even capable, to display HDR back to you. During the latest month, thanks to Adcom from Bologna, I used different displays that actually are HDR ready. One was the Sony Trimaster 4K, and the other one is this Canon that you're seeing right here, both HDR ready. These are professional monitors needed to see and actually grade in HDR for their hardware specifics, obviously. And if you want to know more, please contact Adcom. And by the way, my client needs so far are not exclusively on HDR side. So if the product is not a feature or documentary that doesn't require HDR, I must say that most of the time the HDR pass, it's not asked by my client, and so I don't need an HDR display. And that's why with my minimum HDR expertise, I literally love when I have the possibility to grade a piece in HDR. And if you're asking why, these are the three main reasons. Number one, actually see what your image can give you back is literally incredible. If the first time you see an actual response from the monitor itself on the brightness level, on the dark level, and you are actually irradiated with light when the sun beam up and you see dark areas, really speaking, when you are grading dark pieces. This doesn't happen obviously with the SDR because the nit level it's 1/10 at minimum. And that's bringing me to the second thing, that is the brightness ratio that you have obviously on the panel itself. The luminosity response literally lets you feel the scene. And the third thing is the fact that the possibility in post-production are literally extended. You can actually see things that normally you can't see in SDR. And all this brings us to this scenario, grading for YouTube and my personal experience with that. In December, Nicholas from Media Division contacted me to grade an incredible PEC shot for his really great episode called F0.3 The Impossible Lens. It's an experimental camera he made. I highly suggest you to go and see this video. And he wanted to make the HDR pass of this video, so I make it. Obviously, I wanted to collaborate with him. I really admire his work and I find that everything he is doing is really, really incredible. So thumbs up for Nicholas. And by the way, testing, delivery, an HDR delivery for YouTube with this shot was quite blessed, because for the first time I had a piece that had different case scenario on the same, sequence. We have like 3 sequences, one in the forest, one on the lake, and one underwater, and you have 3 overall difference, luminosity ratio and data ratios that are really, really fun to manage. So about the process itself, I start with the most common process they use for HDR that, spoiler, wasn't the correct one for YouTube. So I started my procedure by opening DaVinci Resolve and opening Nicholas' project. Obviously, Nicholas is not a colorist, so I just found what I was supposed to find. A grade based on a custom structure on every single cut he had. I obviously needed to get rid of that and restart from scratch. So I did what I suggest anyone to do in this situation. I duplicated the timeline and set my old brand new workflow. And I grouped my clips into 3 main situations. The forest clip into clips, the exteriors into exteriors, and the dark clips of the pool into the pool group. So 3 main groups to work with. With this structure, I decided to work display referred. So I decided to manage the color spaces myself in my node tree. So what I did in the pre-clip, the Kit Infinity transcode into ARRI log C color space in order to have the clips floating into ARRI log C. And I used Look Designer and not a color space transform here. On every clip, nothing but a base corrector for exposure and white balance tweaks. And on the post group, I reapplied Look Designer in order to use my film print emulation in ARRI log C and output my image in Rec 709 2.4, because till this point I was monitoring in Rec 709 2.4, and that's where the HDR happened. In this moment I switched my monitor to HDR P3 D65 ST2084, 1000 nits for the HDR pass. By doing so, I add after Look Designer the color space transform. With the color space transform at this point, I was able to switch my Rec 709 Gamma 2.4 into P3 D65 ST2084. By doing so, my image just remained the same as I was looking at the Rec 709 Gamma 2.4 image when the monitor was set to Rec 709 Gamma 2.4. but with the difference that right now I was floating into HDR. I also had a component of 3 correctors in order to recover highlight, blacks, and remapping corrections, because I was switching to HDR. And by doing this with a properly set monitor, I was now working on an HDR scenario, giving a whole look to my clips, finalizing the project, and being ready to export my timeline with the correct metadata. And it was really great. I loved it. The image was looking exactly how I wanted it to be, exactly how it was requested from Nicholas. Even because, spoiler, we haven't time. We had something like a week, a overall week to get this done and also work, giving herself feedbacks. And in that moment, when I graded the overall piece, I realized that it wasn't working for YouTube. I enabled metadatas. I made everything, necessary for the standard HDR deliveries that I commonly do, but YouTube wasn't recognizing my video as an HDR videos. We figured that out after several uploads on YouTube. Even if everything was set in the proper way, even from the screen app that I'm using and other app that I'm using to monitor my export, everything was saying that this video was in HDR, YouTube was just rejecting it. And so after some research, which I obviously write on the blog article, I get that YouTube wants you to work color manage and to have the HDR metadata actually applied from the product settings. So it doesn't support just the delivery metadata that you tweak on HDR metadata. It seems that doesn't care a lot about that. It just wants you to work color managed, everything managed from DaVinci Resolve itself. If you put a color space transform and everything in HDR and metadata are not there for YouTube. We don't know why. So I just decided to start from scratch. I took part of my node tree and I just restarted from zero, from scratch. So again, everything is on the blog, but here is how I did this. As the first thing, I start setting everything right on the product. So I put that color managed in and I open the product settings and put the scenario in this way that you are seeing. Mostly on master setting, video monitoring, I habilitate enable HDR metadata. It might be that, I don't know, you'll see why. And this done, I made this brand new structure. Brand new structure because I wasn't working display referred this time, but I was working color managed. So again, I was letting DaVinci manage the color spaces and I had to recreate this brand new node tree based on what I did, and I regretted. And it was great. And it was delivery time, and we delivered with, again, metadata and habilitated, everything habilitated, and guess what? It worked? No. Why? I don't know. Why I don't know? Because, again, I don't know. Literally, I don't know. So this happened. I took the export, I put it on YouTube, and literally after 2 days from the upload, it enabled the HDR. And so for the first time, Nicholas saw the video in HDR. And it gave me literally 2 or 3 feedbacks about my vision and my interpretation, and I made those tweaks and I re-exported the videos, and it haven't worked for the second time. We waited 2 days, 3 days, it wasn't working. Third export, same thing. Fourth export, same thing. At the fifth export with same things applied, anything, untouched, HDR came back. We don't know why, and it's pretty odd and weird with YouTube that, it enabled HDR with a long time processing in a random way. Even because, again, I haven't touched a thing. And on 5 export with same settings, just 2 of them were working. And so about this, here it is, the Iron C. And you can also watch the overall piece on Media Division channel, and I hope you like it. So my consideration is that YouTube, it's a bit weird on the HDR side. And if you are grading a piece that is going to go on YouTube, you have to take consideration of the most important thing in this scenario and in all the scenarios, which is time. You need time to have the proper upload, because guess what? Iron C made it to YouTube in the end after several exports. But I tried to upload other export with same settings, and it seems like YouTube takes your footage randomly. Sometimes HDR is enabled and it works, and all the other times, I don't know why it doesn't. Maybe it's too busy rendering all their things around the tube. It might make sense, but that's a thing, that's a scenario. But on the other side, this opened like a case history, and I hope that this video is being also a case history for you. If you are grading something to YouTube, just be sure to read the blog article for all the tweaks and everything you need to know also about color spaces and settings that you want to put in. And on the other side, it was a case history on the time side, because I was confident and I knew how to work on that image in HDR. I was really excited, working to that piece in HDR, but I didn't know that it took so long to make it process an image and to actually have a feedback from my client that in that moment was at the other side of the world, and that was the only way and the fastest way possible to monitor an HDR image. I could have sent them the file, but the fact is that we had to both watch it on YouTube, because the final delivery and every one of you will be watching it on YouTube where it is right now. And so this brings us to our final considerations. HDR, it's the nearest future for tons of professionals, not just colorists, but I might say DP filmmakers and everyone that is in the filmmaking game, even if you're not on indie cinema, or if you're working on something that it might be right now at a starting point. The cost also of HDR monitor is decreasing year after year, and right now with 10K you can take a monitor like this one and start grading professionally in HDR. And when I say professional in HDR, I speak for monitors that actually display a truthful image. I'm not talking about OLED TVs. On the electronic side, this monitor are made in that way, are that big, that large, for the electronic function that they have to manipulate different color space and to handle those quantity of data in response. If you don't know, this monitor have a process of image that is called EOTF, that's called electronic opto transfer function. It's the same thing that the color space transform does, which is the OOTF, opto-optical transfer function. It stands for, in simple words, you put a color space in and you want a color space out, or you want a color space displayed. And to display a specific color space that is wider, brighter, more detailed, you require an electronic function and a quantity of hardware and data, to work on that are not really simple to process on a normal TV or a normal HDR TV. So in my opinion, you have to understand that right now is the right moment to jump into it, or better, is the right moment to open your eyes to this scenario that might be more and more closer for standards that are not just Netflix or Prime Video. And about future, this was one of the first YouTube video I'm going to drop on my channel. I started the Plasmaverse podcast with Plasma Republic, the Republic side of Plasma Production, my production company. So if you want to also hear some of our podcast, links are below, and my blog articles and more things to come will happen here or in Plasma. So be sure to click on that bell, stay updated, and thanks for being here. Again, it means the world to me. And thanks to all that one that make this video possible. Special thanks also to Adcom for providing us these HDR monitors, and to Nicolas and Media Division for the Iron Sea project. It was really great to grade it. Until the next time, delivering the future.